This 2006 Nissan Maxima is suffering a trouble code of a P0171. That's lean on bank 1. And as you can see, the short-term fuel trims are all over the place. Today on Fun King Garage, we're going to diagnose it and repair it. My name is Glenn. Since the 80s, I've been collecting many skills. Anything from woodworking to house building to automotive restoration and more. Follow me as we dive deep into the skill sets that I've acquired. Sit down, strap in, and feel the full throttle on Fun King Garage. 1981, the year Mastercaster debuted to the public. MTV was born, and most of all, a vehicle was evolved for a new generation of bootstrappers that was as fast as the hustle and bustle of the big city. The Nissan Maxima, originally released as the 810 Datsun Maxima during the phasing out of the Datsun name. By 2006, it was in its 6th generation with a new, sleek and shaped body design, a 3.5-liter V6 with a whopping 265 horsepower, independent suspension while coupled with a multi-link system, making that Nissan Maxima one heck of a daily driver. This year, the Maxima is celebrating its 40th anniversary. All right, so first of all, we got to get in there and get that engine cover off of there so that we can see what we're working with. These manufacturers are starting to cover everything up, and we need to see the meat of the problem. Then for safety reasons, we definitely want to get that negative battery cable down off of that battery and tucked off to the side so that we don't cause any fires or burn up any electronics. Then to give us a little extra room, let's take the intake snorkel out of there, and that way we can reach everything on the back side of the engine as well. All right, so now that that intake snorkel is out of the way and you can see the whole throttle body, we're going to disconnect the throttle body's electrical connection as well as vacuum hoses and coolant hoses from the throttle body itself. That way it gets everything out of the way. Once those are gone, we're going to move over and take the EGR tube off of the side of the intake manifold. Now that EGR tube is also hooked down to the EGR valve itself, and you need to loosen those bolts up. You may get by without having to actually remove them, but they do need to be loose. And be careful not to lose the gaskets. Now that that is done, I'm going to actually shift over to the other side of the engine because there's some things on the back side of the intake manifold that I have to remove, and I want the intake manifold still fully bolted in place in case I lean on the intake manifold so I don't break anything. So here on the back side of the engine, there is a vacuum hose that goes to the PCV valve, and there's one that runs across to the master cylinder brake booster. So I'm going to get those two disconnected, and I've got one troublesome bolt down in there that I'm going to undo, and what that does is hold in a wiring harness to the back of the intake manifold. Now that I've got all of those out, I'm actually going to switch back to the other side of the engine because there's two bolts in the back of the upper plenum that actually hold it support-wise to a bracket. These are probably the most difficult bolts in this whole entire job. And I've seen other people do it in some really, really crazy ways. But all I'm going to do is slide my arm in behind the intake plenum, and with a 12mm short socket, I will loosen those up and get them out of there. So something that I've found that's very helpful, not only for this particular task, but many that are just like it, is a palm ratchet that I picked up. It was just an affordable set, but it comes in so handy. And it allows me to reach in with a socket and get the bolts out when they're still just a little too tight to turn them by hand. So this gives me the leverage I need to get them out without taking up too much room. All right, so now moving to the front of the car, we're going to remove the vacuum valve as well as the vacuum canister that are bolted to the top of the plenum. I take these off and I just kind of lay them in front of the engine. I feel that you don't really have to undo the vacuum hoses. It's going to all come out together. This gives us access to the bolts that hold the upper intake plenum in. Nissan has given specific instructions to remove the bolts in a specific order, and that would be number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, and number 5. And then you'll be able to remove the bolts themselves, and your intake plenum should lift up and come off. So once we determined that this intake manifold had that hairline crack in there, which is definitely where our vacuum leak was coming from, we took a trip over to the junkyard and picked up a replacement for just 35 bucks, much cheaper than new. Oddly, when we were in the junkyard, one of the ones that we pulled off also had a piece of fuel hose on it instead of the emissions hose, and the tab was broken on that one as well. So we figured because of the thickness on this, it was putting undue pressure. So with the new one home and clean, we were able to transfer all of the parts, the throttle body, the brackets, and the valve over to the new one, and now have it ready to put in. So now that we've got the replacement intake plenum, we're going to put it back onto the engine, making sure that we slide it into the EGR tube. Now, here again, the torque spec is very important, and the torque sequence is very important. Nissan calls for a 13 to 15 foot-pound torque, which is very, very light. Once that's torqued in, you can then reach around back behind the engine and put those 2 bolts back into that supporting bracket. Now those bolts are actually very important because there's a lot of weight hanging on that plenum, and it could actually cause that plenum to crack if you don't replace those bolts. Once that's done, you can actually move back to hooking up all of your coolant lines and vacuum lines once again. So everything is back together now, and being that we were smart enough to disconnect the negative cable before we started all of this, it's not going to cause any issues with our throttle body. On Nissan cars, if you disconnect the throttle body or move it manually while the battery is still hooked to the computer, it will actually cause you to have to rerun the throttle positioning sequence. But we're good, and it's all back together now, and now we can run the diagnostic software and make sure that the problem is actually fixed. Well, as you can see, the short-term fuel trims are back in line, and that means that this repair was an absolute success. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Fun King Garage. If you like what we're doing, we'd love for you to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for notifications. Of course, thumbs up and comments are always appreciated as well. And until next time.